Happy Friday and welcome to the last day of Circa's research webinar series. Through the last 3 weeks, we are trying to showcase you different kinds of projects that Circa has been funding and then conducting it. And today we are going to finalize it with a very special event to gather all this information under the legal and policy tools for climate resilience. We are going to have first our webinar, and then it's going to be followed by the panel with our researchers. I'm Dr. Yaprak Anat, Assistant Director of Research at Circa, and I'm happy to present you our presenter today, Luen Cooley. Luen Cooley is a 2020 Yukon Law grad focusing on energy and environmental law, who joined Circa as a legal fellow working on a climate resilience policy. She also currently serves on the Connecticut Sitting Council and the Town of Mansfield Planning and Zoning Commission. She has been working on a comparison of state resilience policies, which she's going to talk about it today. Without further ado, Luen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yaprak. So today I'm going to talk about legal and policy tools for climate resilience at the state and local level. And we've been working on a comparison with this project. Here's a description of the project. We've been working on a comparison of state resilience policies with the intention of illuminating innovative actions taken by other states that can inform Connecticut's policy moving forward. I'll also talk briefly about some of the legislative gains in the last session and some of our future work. I've been working on this project with Professor Joseph McDougald, who's Circa's Director of Applied Research, and we hope to deliver a white paper on the state comparison soon. So to start with, I'm sure most people on this call are quite familiar with climate resilience, but just to avoid any confusion, the definition that we are working under today is climate resilience is to establish resilient coastal communities where structures and critical infrastructure in the flood zone are adapted to withstand occasional flooding and protected by healthy buffering ecosystems, where critical services infrastructure and transportation hubs are located on safer, higher ground, and where strong connections exist between the two. And the intersection between resilience is with adaptation, with hazard mitigation, with environmental and climate justice issues, equity issues, and land use decisions. So for this project, we have been surveying adjacent and other coastal states, mostly in the New England and the Upper East Coast area. We've looked at the history, structure, and organization of the state response to climate change as a whole, but focused mostly on resilience policy and how it impacts municipalities. We've looked at state level legislation, but also executive orders and climate change and resilience financing and specific enabling legislation for municipal actions. So the initial broad findings for this work, one of the things that came through was the importance of access to standardized baseline data, using the most current scientific empirical data tool, and then having good tools to support municipal planning, and also having flexible financing options that municipalities can access. State support for local and regional resilient infrastructure is crucial, and making bond money available to municipalities for resilience projects helps municipalities achieve their goals. Resilience is, in fact, an intersectional solution to a complex issue. Municipal resilience can encompass infrastructure projects, hazard mitigation, land use planning, social and behavioral community building, and the effective and efficient forward planning must be based on science and evidence-based information. Many states are centering their efforts in resilience in climate justice, with a focus on equity. Some states are, in fact, including that within statute. And then something that might not be as obvious, but the mitigation of the root causes of climate change really needs to happen simultaneously with adaptation and resilience efforts. The two are often paired, and states approach them both simultaneously, but there isn't necessarily a lot of overlap between what's seen as straight mitigation efforts and adaptation and resilience efforts. Okay, and findings that are useful to Connecticut. We've found a variety of different mechanisms to fund municipal resilience and adaptation initiatives. Everything from direct appropriations in state budgets to municipal and state level bonding issues, allocating funds from specific revenue streams like RGGI, enabling municipalities to offer tax abatement to residents to complete resilient projects, and state level competitive grant programs that municipalities can access. Funding streams usually are not intended to cover fully project costs, but they require a municipal match or federal or other funding streams. Some states require or mandate municipal resilience planning. Funding from state sources can be dependent upon completion of a resilience or hazard mitigation plan. Some states have also enabled localities to create or expand the mandate for authorities to provide for flexibility for specific local needs. So enabling local authorities like stormwater authorities or stormwater utilities, expanding the mandate of flood and erosion control boards to include municipalities, or even creating resilience authorities that have the ability to issue bonding to design, build, maintain, and operate resilience infrastructure. So I'd like to do a brief comparison of some states' approach to climate adaptation and resilience. And I'm going to focus on three areas: statewide resilience planning, finance, and local legal authorities. And we're going to specifically look at some of the New England states that are near us. So if you can look at this table, you can see that all of the states that we surveyed do have some kind of state-level climate plan. Most states have a state-level climate council that's made up of a variety of stakeholders that develop and give advice about implementation for a state-level climate plan. Connecticut is one of those states. Many of the states have created a state resilience office with a state resilience officer who is in charge of planning. Connecticut has recently done this as well. And states have tried to develop a resilience toolkit that can be used by municipalities to access information and assist in planning. Some municipalities have mandated including resilience planning by state statute. And Connecticut has not yet done this. That's something that could be considered. Massachusetts and New Jersey have both mandated municipal resilience planning by municipalities. Connecticut has statutorily included sea level rise standards, but not all states have. Massachusetts has considered this since 2017, but has not passed legislation doing so. New York has passed sea level rise standard legislation, but other states have yet to do so. When it comes to finance, that is really the big question. Everyone can recognize that going forward, including resilience as a consideration when building infrastructure, especially in coastal communities, is extremely important. But how do you finance that? And states have used a variety of mechanisms. Some states have included bonding for climate change. In the recent appropriations bill passed in Connecticut, there was $25 million for resilience and microgrids. Massachusetts and New York have both passed large climate bills, including $2 billion and $3 billion for climate change related activities. New Jersey has not yet done so. Rhode Island recently passed a $74 million bill in the current session. From state bonding, another way that municipalities are helped are when states offer a program to grant municipalities money for resilient projects. Connecticut has done this in a limited extent in the past, and with the new appropriation will likely do so in the future. And Massachusetts has a complex plan that works very well for allowing municipalities to apply for resilience grants, which we'll go into in a little more depth later on in the presentation. New Jersey does not have a program yet to do that. And Rhode Island has recently required that states do complete a municipal resilience plan, and then they can access $14 million in municipal funding. And then another idea is including investment lending for resilience projects. The Connecticut Green Bank was one of the innovative ways that Connecticut has started to finance climate change investment. And recently in the latest legislative session, the Green Bank's mandate was expanded to include the financing of resilience projects. Massachusetts has proposed having something like the Connecticut Green Bank since 2017, but have yet to enact it. New York and New Jersey both have a green energy financing bank, and Rhode Island has a Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank, which also can finance resilience projects. And then legal authorities that municipalities can enact are things like stormwater authorities. All states have that. Connecticut just enabled that in 2021. And then Connecticut also enabled flood erosion and resilience authorities in 2021 as well. And then just quickly to talk about mitigation. Mitigation really is the area where in 2021, Connecticut did not make improvements. All states are involved in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. But of the states that originally signed on to the Transportation Climate Initiative, Connecticut was the first to not pass an actual enabling legislation in the last session. Currently, Rhode Island still has a bill that has passed the Senate in Rhode Island, and they are still in session. And I couldn't find information about Massachusetts, whether they have actually enacted TCI legislation, but they are still intending to be a part of the Transportation Climate Initiative. And then another way to compare states is to look at what their emissions reduction targets are. In recent years, many states have made their targets more ambitious. Connecticut has not yet done so. A bill to do so was not passed in the last legislative session. And this just gives you a comparison of where these states' targets are. Oops, sorry. And then to give a little bit more depth to the comparison, I wanted to talk briefly about Massachusetts, because Massachusetts is a pretty good model of how to work on both mitigation and resilience and adaptation in tandem and provide technical planning to municipalities, which can identify gaps and create competitive grants to match municipal funding and encourage resilience projects. So currently in 2021, Massachusetts passed an act creating a next generation roadmap for Massachusetts climate policy. Primarily, this was about mitigation efforts, but it also codified environmental justice provisions in the policy. There was some talk about resilience as well in this bill. The previous municipal resilience programs in Massachusetts are the MVP program, Green Communities Grants, Coastal Resilience Grant Program, and Conservation Service Grants. Stormwater utilities also have been previously enabled. So the takeaways with Massachusetts are In 2018, the $2 billion of climate funding bonding really led to a big boost in municipal resilience planning and municipal action projects. Mandating municipal planning to include hazard mitigation and climate vulnerabilities is really a very effective way to identify resilience gaps. And having a two-step process where first municipalities have to engage in municipal planning, they can get funding to do that and also technical capability assistance. And then from those plans, identify actions that they can take where they can further apply for action grants and gain more financial and technical support to actually complete those grant projects. The MVP program is flexible and it allows communities to determine their needs through the planning process. And it also funds a wide variety of programs from actual infrastructure programs to community building type activities. And here's just a map that shows the types of municipal resilience projects that have been funded by state grants. These were grants that were by the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and most municipalities so far have received MVP planning grants. In pink, you can see those communities that have been awarded MVP action grants. Orange is coastal pollution and remediation grants. Blue are coastal resilience grants, and green are grants through the Division of Conservation Services that are mostly for natural areas preservation. And then just to give some further caveats from the work that we found that was not reflected in the table, some interesting funding strategies that we found from other states. Examples are in New Hampshire, they passed a bill that allowed municipalities to create coastal resilience incentive zones. And it creates a capital reserve fund for a town to create a trust that can then support municipal costs that are incurred by sea level rise or storm surge or flooding. And municipalities can grant qualifying resilience projects tax relief. So far, I haven't found examples of municipalities that have created and used these incentive zones, but several municipalities have discussed it and are considering this as they go forward. In South Carolina, they have a resiliency revolving fund, which allows for low interest loans for flooded voluntary home buyouts and floodplain restoration. Managed retreat is something that South Carolina has done quite a bit of. It may not be something that is as applicable for Connecticut. Virginia has a community flood preparedness fund, which grants capacity building and planning and flood prevention protection projects and studies. Texas has a flood infrastructure fund, which provides loans and grants for planning, construction, and rehabilitation activities, which includes nature-based solutions to reduce or mitigate flooding for cities, counties, districts, and authorities. While Texas does not have a state-level resilience office, most large municipalities have created offices of resilience and are working within their jurisdictions to make their communities more resilient. Maryland has one of the most interesting, to me at least, examples. They created a few years ago resilience authorities, and this allows municipalities to create an authority. And so far, Charles County and Annapolis and Arundel County have done this, and this allows those localities to undertake and support resilience infrastructure projects through financing structures like bonding and leveraging public and private investment. And now just a brief discussion of what Connecticut has done so far. So Connecticut has previously passed some resilience legislation, and in 2021, we passed House Bill 64041, which authorized stormwater authorities, flood and erosion and resiliency boards, and expanded the Green Bank Authority to finance resilience projects. Appropriations were made for resilient capacity studies and development of tools through CIRCA, and 25 million in bond funds for microgrant and resilient grant loan and pilot program. Not passed, however, were a GIS bill that would have increased access to data for planning, a more ambitious GHG emissions reduction goals, and the TCI. Okay, and my further work going forward, we're going to talk more about stormwater authorities in the future. We're hoping to develop some tools for municipalities if they wish to enact those. And I did have some recommendations going forward, which I will just leave on the screen because we are out of time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Cooley. If you have any questions to her, please type it to the chat box and on the Q&A box, and we're trying to answer them at the end of our panel. Right now, I would like to actually invite all of our panelists and Professor Joe McDougall, who's going to moderate our panel. You can, all of our panelists can turn on their camera.
Hello, Yaprak.
Hi. Professor McDougall is also a professor at the UConn Law, and he's the executive director of Center for Energy and Environmental Law. And he's going to moderate this panel session with our other panelists that you know of and listen to them during the whole 3 weeks. We have our executive director, Jim O'Donnell, we have Dr. Mariana Fragomeni, Dr. Norman Garrick, Dr. Rosalyn Ray, and Dr. Charles Tao, and we're all going to join and answer the questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Yaprak. So I think first we have up Professor James O'Donnell. Jim's probably known to almost all of you as a professor in marine sciences, as well as somebody with a background in oceanography and applied mathematics. Jim is the executive director of CERCA, and I think Jim is going to talk to us about a question that's coming up throughout, particularly a lot of the work Luann was just talking about, the integration of local science versus the national standards. So Jim, please go ahead.
Thanks. I won't be very long. I just want to address the question of why is Connecticut trying to develop its own program to develop guidelines for planning, like how high the sea walls have to be, how high the roads have to be, when do we need to expect to take action for climate change? These are questions that have been posed to me and to others in the state. Yet the federal agencies provide lots of information on that kind of stuff too. So why do we duplicate that? Well, the answer is we don't. The agencies largely have responsibility for the whole country, and perhaps the resolution that they can create with models is designed to allow them to provide information that's uniform of standards and uniform in format to all those areas. In Connecticut, the flood zones that we see are controlled by small scale geography variability, and in Connecticut that can be as small as a few meters. Tide gates limit the flow of water from Long Island Sound into marshes, and therefore they control whether roads get flooded or not. And we have to choose whether to modify the road or modify the tide gate sometimes, right? So the point being that models which provide general information about flooding aren't useful or aren't adequate to design adequately engineered adaptation projects, because those are sensitive to these small scale variability effects. So anyway, my point is the reason that we're doing lots of technical things in Circa and elsewhere that seem to be closely aligned to things federal agencies provide is because the federal agency results are not quite adequate for project design. But more importantly, they don't allow the evaluation of different options. So if, for example, we were to change the height of a road or the width of an inlet in order to control flooding, that would not be possible with available programs that the federal government has. So to do what if tests, right, you need to have a local model anyway. Right. So those are two major reasons. One is adequacy of resolution and the ability to evaluate adaptation options. Those are the main reasons. And finally, there are other developments in science technology that are more quickly integrated to our planning process, but when the locally appropriate science is being applied. So that's it for me.
Thank you. So what we wanted to do with this part of the program is to ask some of the questions. I mean, it's a great project because everyone's touching on different elements of things that construct, I think, as you saw from sort of the way this gets turned into a complete policy. So why don't we start with a couple of sort of joint questions, and then we'll, in just a few, we'll do the anyone chime in and tell us something. So Rosalyn and Mariana, why don't we start with the two of you combined? Based on your team's research, what are the areas of the state that you think, what are the areas of the state where towns should take action most urgently? See if I can say that without jumbling it more. You know, where should people take action, both, you know, geographically, but also, you know, in a policy space? So I don't know who wants to go first. Randomly, Rosalie, you want to give it a whirl, and then we'll go to Mariana?
I'll pass this one off to Norman. I think he has the
I
answer.
would never stand in the way of Norman Garrick. Please, please go right ahead. Hello, Norman.
Hello. But based on our work, I think the issue goes back to something that is very consistent across the state, is that we have lots of infrastructure for transit. We have really good infrastructure in terms of town centers and city centers. And in Connecticut, those are resources that we have let fall by the wayside. So in my mind, the most important thing that we need to do in Connecticut is start to reevaluate some of these existing resources, including our town centers, and to see how we can start to build around these places, and specifically around the larger city centers like Bridgeport. New Haven actually has done a fairly good job, but trying to learn from that and build around those resources. And those concentrated centers, I think, are really important to the future of Connecticut.
Well, Mariana, I know that must tie into what I'm guessing your priority might be. How does it look from your perspective?
Yeah, there's definitely some overlaps. Bridgeport and New Haven, looking from the heat, the study that we've been doing, these are two towns that have been honestly lighting up like Christmas trees. They're very urbanized. New Haven's starting to do things from the policy side, but there's more to be done. We got to think about heat as both as an urban thing, and thinking about green spaces as a way of adapting and creating adaptive capacity for our communities. And tie that into social vulnerability, tie it into public health. But our study also showed that, sprawling areas to the west of Bridgeport and to the north of New Haven are also showing signs that things need to, they need to start thinking about their green space and conserving it, and really thinking of it as an infrastructure, and a way of ensuring the quality of life of our communities.
So I like that, because really your projects address not very different, but considerably different metrics that tie in. I was wondering then, one of the things we're seeing as it goes to coastal resilience, but I think it's a problem throughout the policies, is how should towns consider the economic benefits and costs when they're thinking about redevelopment to address these or any of the other concerns? I mean, how do they look at it? And I thought, Charles, if maybe that one seems uniquely queued up for you, but I was wondering if you could talk about that, then maybe the Rosalyn Norman block could also address it, because you deal in very much the CIP world. So Charles, how should the towns think about it, analyze it, recognizing the types of decisions they make?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I was actually, when I read the questions beforehand, I was wondering exactly what you meant by redevelopment. Now I think it's a little more clear. What we had done in our work was really look at how people pick up market signals with regard to the risk and how people might respond in their own resiliency and adaptation planning. Things like elevating houses and things came up as we were moving through. So in thinking about how a town would need to think about the benefits and costs, I think one of the glaring things that came from us is that these are dynamic problems. Houses that are vulnerable are not staying static. They're going to decline, and that is going to hit assessment roles in certain ways, as well as doing retreat or other planning. So in thinking about how to answer this, that's what I would say. I think that the towns need to consider that planning needs to go dynamically across. This is not just a simple loss.
And if I think in my spotty past, I was on a town's board of finance, and one of the things that struck me is the sort of both the short and the long term of capital planning. So if they're trying to look at how they're going to actually secure funds with that, you're sort of taking it and maybe bring it concretely into direct redevelopment around TOD. That's why I wanted to pair it with the Rosalyn Norman wing. Say question, taking with Charles's comments, how should they literally balance it within the budget themselves as they're making the decision this year or next spring or December when they're doing their budget drafts? How should they think about it?
I mean, I think that's a really good question, but I also want to push sort of up a scale to the state. That in our research, what we found were the towns had a pretty good awareness of where they wanted to put TOD. They had some of that local science that Jim had talked about knowing where the risks were, but there's not a lot of guidance or metrics or planning on the state level to help with the prioritization of where do we need to focus this resource, where is the most bang for the buck in rehabilitating this transit infrastructure, in locating this TOD. That there's a lot of sort of, if the town has a good idea, they put it forward and the state reacts to it. But I think that actually what is needed to help towns plan in their budget in the long term is a kind of program like Luann was presenting, where there are real clear metrics and goals and guidance as to, we're targeting this part of Metro North right now because of this, and these are the targets we want you to meet.
So thank you for that easy cue up, Luann. In terms of that the state municipal interaction that we had, could you talk a little bit more about where you ended your presentation on what was just passed? And also a question from the chat I want to integrate into this piece is, when it comes to awareness and training for the decision makers, particularly the zoners, we know Desegregate CT has some training going in. Is there a place that you see within the current legislation or within that will both help them in their planning, but help them in their awareness? Some of this information takes a lot of doing to acquire. So a compound question, sorry about that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, those are terrific questions. I do think that the recent legislation passed that mandates training for town officials is really important. And I think that training could be integrated into including mechanisms to prioritize resilience issues. I think that one of the first things that Connecticut should consider as a state is perhaps incorporating to the PCOD statutes something that would mandate towns to consider resilience in their planning, in their 10-year planning, so that it's on the books. It's something that everyone is required to do. And I think that that would help to drive the thinking so that projects going forward would incorporate that. And if you've got that as a mandate to begin with, that this kind of planning is a requirement, then when your town officials are starting to look at projects that are proposed in their area, they can do it through that resilience, forward-thinking lens. So I can see that those two things would work well together. And, you know, hopefully, I mean, me personally, as someone who is an elected official and who really had a lot to learn about how planning works, the elected officials have one set of knowledge, but your actual town planners, the professionals who work in this area, people who are at the COGS that have a professional capacity, they're aware of these things, and they need support as well from the state to be able to help the towns recognize that resilience is something that they need to think about in their forward planning.
So if I could, Mariana, if I could use you as an example, if we think about, so I someone who was also served on elected boards too long and long ago, myself, one of the things I actually believe in is the POCD process that Luann was just mentioning, but towns only plan what they have in recognition. So I want to open the question to everyone, but start with Mariana. In terms of things that you think should be on the municipal agenda, things that you wish the towns every 10 years would sit back and say, I should be thinking about this. Both sort of two, what should that issue be? You know, the issue should be my research project, right? Whatever that is, but what should that issue be? But also, you know, what are the, how do you think they should go about building that sort of expanded list? So Mariana, if we could maybe start with you and then open it to everybody.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going very in line with what Luann was just saying and incorporating these into like a plan of conservation and development where it's revised every 10 years and you're thinking through and you're allowing yourself to rethink what needs to be on your priority. Allows you to think about something like heat, which is what I'm focusing on, kind of in a step-by-step approach. First and foremost, how is this impacting our communities right now? Because it is. Mm-hmm. And as a nation, heat is killing most people over the last 30 years. It's a thing. It kills more than hurricanes and flooding. And sometimes it is the aftermath of these things. So you get hit by a hurricane, your infrastructure is wiped out, and the next thing that's affecting your community is heat. So we need to start to think about these things at the planning level as a multi-hazards approach. And I would love to see heat being mentioned in plans more than just it affects all of us equally. That is not the case. So thinking about heat, thinking about equity, and thinking of planning for these things and sort of being able to move the marker as we move along. So first and foremost, the safety of our people, and then thinking about the infrastructure and thinking about, like I said, in our case, urban greening as an infrastructure is something that helps us create adaptive capacity. I think those are kind of my two things of like, this needs to be, we need to start thinking about these at layers, systems thinking. As a planner myself, very much a system thinker, and thinking about these as in multiple layers and how they are kind of checks and balances between these things and the approaches that we could make.
That's great. Charles, what do you think? What would be on your, I wish you guys would consider this, you know, or call to your attention wish list for at least the municipal level?
For the municipal level, I mean, from what we have discovered, it seems that folks buying homes in the floodplain know very little about the exposure to risk they're getting to. And so I don't know if it's a municipal question or if this needs to be at a different, at a state level of information disclosure. You know, sometimes if you give people the right information, they'll make an informed decision and take on the risk that they feel most comfortable with. So I don't know if I have a specific municipal level, except one of the other things we noticed was the disparity in the municipal the different municipalities' ability to respond to legislative mandates, for example. So I don't know if that's something that should be bubbled up at the state level as well.
No, I think there's I know one of the things I used to, was a mantra in one of my boards was that zoning is communication, right? That the regulations communicate something about it. And the part of that was also about risk. Rosalyn, Norman, what would you put on your plan of conservation and development bullet for consideration?
Well, I'll start and then let Norman finish. But I think one thing that came up was, now that we have some of the shapefiles and metrics necessary to incorporate sea level rise and its possible effects in the TOD plans that towns are making, so those were sort of slightly separate from the plan of conservation and development, there wasn't actually a discussion of what it means that a parcel will be flooding 30 years from now, even if it's not flooding now. And I think that if there's one thing that I want towns to start having the conversation about, and I think ideally both towns and cities and the state, is what does that mean we need to do with this parcel now? How do we think? I don't think that towns are yet sitting back and reflecting every 10 years on what it means to know something might happen in 2050 and what we do about it. And so I think that having the mandate for resilience planning, but also making sure that it's at the sort of parcel development level, as well as general infrastructure, I think is an important piece. But I'm sure Norman has even more insight.
Well, I don't know if I have even more, but I have a different insight in that it strikes me as I'm looking at the work that we have done, how impossible it is to actually do resilient planning, ecologically based planning at a town level, based on the fact that we have divided up the state into 169 tiny units. And a lot of the issues that we're dealing with really crosses those units. The ecological issues definitely are cross-border, but so are the economic relationships. And I think if we need anything here is really to have a better regional understanding of how these individual towns can work together to come up with plans that make sense. For example, the idea that all 169 towns or whatever are going to have TODs doesn't really make sense on its face. So we really need to figure out how these units, how our individual units can start working together, can start coordinate planning so that it is about the future resiliency of the region that we live in.
So feeding off that for a second, if we sort of bubble our way from towns toward the state, but I'm going to take one interim stop on the way. One of the things, and Luann, maybe you can talk about this next, that surprised me as part of Luann's research was the extent to which a common GIS made a big difference in a lot of, I like everyone with a planning background smiles, I don't know, made such a difference to these resilience programs. And that got me wondering, what are the other common metrics, the things that are just inappropriate for the 169 chopped up pieces that Norman mentioned, in terms of just understanding, whether it's understanding of risk, understanding, what are the things you wish that would be at least the type of metric that would show up? So Luann, why don't I toss to you to either talk a little bit about GIS or address that question, but think about the things you think are appropriate for the state to settle the different treatment of data or priority.
Sure. So, well, first to give a hat tip to Rosalie, this actually came from something that we noticed when we first spoke with Rosalie, and she showed her map, which had a few tiny gaps, and the explanation for that was that the data was just difficult to find and to get, or simply didn't exist, because there isn't some kind of a common standard that's used throughout the state, and data that can be accessed by people who are doing this kind of work. And I know that that's something that Yukon Clear has advocated, and a group of people working through the COGS have advocated for years to have a standardized planning tool like a common GIS clearinghouse that would enable people to access the data more easily. And most other states have something like that. There may be many reasons why Connecticut does not so far. But hopefully that is something that could be overcome, because just that kind of access would make the kind of regional planning much more efficient, much more effective, and it could lead to more cooperation. You said earlier that Norman had said earlier that one of the big problems is that effectively climate change does not see borders. It's not seeing these edges of jurisdictions. And having towns have mechanisms and ways that they can do cross-jurisdictional work, I think is really imperative. And that's the kind of work that the state can facilitate, and perhaps with granting that allows for regional grants, for municipalities to work together for things, for the state to step in when infrastructure that might be needed would cross jurisdictions. The state could perhaps be a part of that kind of a question, but that I think really is one of the real challenges for Connecticut, and this idea that Norman also brought up, that there are different capacities in our different towns. This was really brought home to me when we spoke to some of the officials in Maine who are working on their climate program there. And Maine has an even greater exacerbated problem where they have over 500 towns, some which don't have much municipal governments at all or planning capacity, and then some which do and have greater problems. So it really is an issue that many states are facing when you have specific areas that have specific kinds of problems like coastlines, and then you have other areas of the state which are facing other types of problems, perhaps more urban heat island issues, flooding issues. And so having the capacity to deal with all of those kinds of issues, and especially to help those areas that are adjacent to one another, but are different legal jurisdictions, work together to solve them, I think is really important.
So Rosalie, since you were hat tipped for identifying the data gap to us, what are the common metrics that you think are inappropriate, or common tools that the state should be settling instead of municipalities developing on their own?
I think that's a tricky question, at least when it comes to transportation, because it's sort of local and regional at the same time. And so I hesitate to say sort of the state should be planning transit all by itself, because I think we have that in many cases with CT Transit, and it doesn't always sort of serve the needs of the local communities all that well. We haven't really thought a lot about our bus system or done a lot of work on it, and I think that's in part because it's kind of removed from the town's responsibility, even though the towns are the most responsive and aware of residents' needs. So I think that from the transportation side, it's about finding that sort of multi-scalar balance between allowing the towns to have a little more say in transportation and land use being thought of together. Right now they have autonomy in land use and almost no say in transit. And I think the ideal there is take away some of that autonomy in land use, but empower them to do more planning of transit within their borders. It's New Haven that took the initiative to do Move New Haven. Hartford's thinking about walking and biking and all sorts of stuff, that there are ways that cities can take more of a role in transportation, but I think it has to come with some loss of autonomy on the land use side. So if it were up to me, I would want some density metrics along lines that are going to get investment, a state transit plan that thinks about its bus networks in a real way and not just its new bus rapid transit and its rail, but to think about where it's already spending a lot of money operating bus service and encouraging towns to encourage developers to go where the service already is, rather than the bus network, getting the call, which we heard about a lot in things. It's like the medical office moved out to the Greenfield development, and now we have to run a bus line there, which is, you know, $50K that we now have to spend doing that. And so the state needs to put in those kinds of hard and soft incentives, and the town should get a little bit more invested in how their people get around.
I like this. This reminds me of the New York radio shows where we address, you know, potholes, and, you know, we've got the bus line at the small, but you're right. Mariana, do you see it the same way, or is, because your problem, the study seems so direct, you know, you've got a problem in Hartford, but is it really a state problem in terms of measurement, understanding what's too hot, what's unacceptable? How do you look at it?
Yeah, I think the regional perspective, I mean, when Norman was saying, heat doesn't see boundaries, right? It doesn't, but it affects us in different ways. Communities are vulnerable in different ways. So there's a role for the local municipalities, and there's a role for the state to help municipalities understand where we are regionally bound. And some of that is in the ways we've actually changed our landscapes and what we're doing to our landscapes and what we can conserve, because a lot of research in my field is showing, hey, in our cases, tree canopy is really important. Wetlands, woodied wetlands are super important. We need to conserve these, and it's not patches of them. It's really enable them to be interconnected. That's regional. That's at the state level. We need CTD to help us support that and help our towns to see how they're connected to each other and how one town's conservation needs to stretch to the next. So, and DPH as well, we need public health. We need to think about how this impacts the health of our children, the elderly, people with existing conditions. So there's room for everyone. There's room for things to get thought out of at the town level. And like I said, we have cities doing this. New Haven's been thinking about urban heat island policies, green roofs, Hartford's 1,000 Trees project. We've got examples in the state of trying to take the reins on that, but we need more. We need more support. We need, and GIS data is going to be extremely important at the state level. You know, we've tried to do studio work with students before. One town has data, the next one doesn't, and it's really hard to get stuff done when we don't have plenty of information to go around.
And Charles, the idea of common, I was thinking about a question like this when first I saw you present some of your results in terms of understanding. It seemed to me you did a lot of work just to even look at the analysis. Is there something that would have made this understanding of the trade-offs and the economic impact easy by legislative definitions, or is this better into the, I've got a lawyer asking an economist question, you know, we're raking it in here, but is this something that's really just not that sort of government action? How do you think, what would help?
With specifically regard to common data sets, is that?
Yes, yeah, data sets, definitions, the ability to look at the problem in the same way in different towns.
So our study was focused on hypothetical retreat scenarios, but as we were going through, we find that there are many other choices that homeowners in the state can make. And we spent a significant amount of time trying to figure out where people are making decisions to elevate their properties, for example. And it's virtually impossible. I mean, you essentially have to go to some towns and open the folders on the homes to figure out if they're elevated or not. So this is one of the places that we are putting together another proposal with Jim to actually try to get some standardized data sets to understand how people are investing in their properties in floodplains, how people are investing in their own adaptation decisions. So we can figure out where the push and the pull of federal and state policy are helping and where they're maybe not helping. So that's, I guess that's one data hole that we found glaringly difficult to deal with.
That's a big one, right? I mean, that's everything and ties into the, you know, for those of you who are long Circa watchers, you'll know that starting with Alex Felsen and beyond, we talk about zones of shared risk and have done lots of expressions of it. Jim, you're the king of scale. So what do you think is in the hands of towns and the hands of municipalities, and where could that balance be changed?
Yeah, well, I'm a physicist, right? So comments on economics and politics and geography should be, calibrated appropriately. But it does. I mean, I do want to make people aware that the goal of the Resilient Connecticut initiative has been regional plans. As part of our consultation process, we've identified a lot of town issues, and we're happy to try and help towns individually. But there is so many problems that need to be addressed. We need to divide them up. Right? So there are problems that homeowners have, and they need to take responsibility to address them where they can. And there's things that they can't do by themselves, like their roads and their sewer systems, and so towns need to take care of those. And we can provide technical assistance and ideas as to how to do that effectively. But things where the gap has been in Connecticut is in regional projects, and that's what the NDRC program, or the Resilient Connecticut program that we're operating, takes care of. And as part of that, we're trying to integrate maps from a variety of sources to do, and YAPRAC's really leading that. And but we've got like a pretty good, a pretty good situation right now where we've got a list of potential projects that we're going to try and refine in the near future. And that process by which we consult broadly, look for synergies and co-benefits from flood risk reduction projects, we're going to try and extend to the rest of the state. And a legacy of that will be more uniform access to data, right? There'll be, because we need to, when we look for regional projects, we need to integrate things from different towns. And that is hard, and I think several people have noted that. But this project makes an example of why it's useful to have. Otherwise, what I think is happening is that a bunch of people who from academia are saying to the state agencies, you guys need to synthesize your GIS stuff, so we can use it, right? And I think when we demonstrate the actual value of having that, we can justify the expense and the trouble it takes people who have got real other jobs, in agencies. They've got to do permitting and they've got to do planning and stuff to make their the work that they do more beneficial to the rest of the state. Anyway.
And I think it's part of the reason why I like some of the comparative approach, when you realize things like GIS are the cornerstone of other successful structures in other states, where it wouldn't necessarily be obvious to us. So in the very few minutes we have left, I was hoping to talk about recommendations. So this is your chance. Congratulations, you all get to be governor, at least for about 20 seconds. What's would be your top sort of key list of this? And Luann, I'll save you for the last because I know you had a slide on it. But Mariana, why don't we start with you if sort of your lead recommendation? Well, we'll do Mariana, Rosalie, and then we'll go to Charles and Luann.
That's a hard question. I think my approach is, let's deal with what we know. We know that we're vulnerable right now. So let's start thinking about, from the heat perspective, how do we deal with this from an emergency preparedness point of view? How do we get prepared? How do we communicate to our communities the potentials of risk and dealing with the now, and then move to the next step? By dealing with the vulnerabilities, we understand who's vulnerable and the differences, and we understand which communities are suffering more. And we can move on and then start to seeing the connections between planning and the environmental and the human dimensions of this, and we can expand it and incorporate it into policies, into comprehensive plans and all that stuff. But we need to kind of reckon that we're vulnerable already. It's, we talk about climate change, but it's not in the future. It's here. It's now. It's going to get worse. So we need to deal with it. The inertia needs to stop. So that's my number one recommendation, like if I could right now.
Thank you. Governor Ray? What's your what's on the top of your recommendation hit parade?
Invest in the cities and recognize that we already have the walkable centers that other states are spending millions trying to build as TOD, that we've done a lot of sort of new greenfield TOD, but it's time to really say that Bridgeport and New Haven and Hartford and Stamford and Norwalk and even Milford's Little Town Center, they've all got these walkable districts. And it's making sure that the service meets their needs. It's making sure that places like Bridgeport have express stations so that they have a better link to other economic centers. It's planning our transit system for mode shift away from cars and planning our transit system for the street network we already have and is usable.
Perfect. Charles, you have absolute power. What's on the top of your list?
I think from what we went through, I've mentioned this already, I would really like to see put in place a more understandable disclosure process for transactions occurring in these floodplains. So honestly, just so I can stop fielding phone calls from people looking at buying houses and wondering how they should evaluate their flood risk. I wish there was some way we could communicate this and make it mandatory on transactions going forward.
And if I could, there was a question in the chat sort of more broadly on this topic about opening up competitive bidding processes, maybe in reflecting as part of resilience process. I assume that's the same, that would fall in your same category of open disclosure.
I'm looking in the questions. Oh, was this a question for Luann? Or?
Yeah, it comes from Luann's part of Luann's piece too about recommendations for competitive bidding.
Is it a question? Are you asking me or are we asking Luann? I guess this one could.
I think then I'll transition. So.
Okay.
So Luann, I know you've got a lot of recommendations, but I'm wondering if you can triage a couple of them so
Sure.
we can stick the landing almost.
Sure. I think most of my recommendations really come down to coming up with a mechanism, whether it's a mandate or other kinds of encouragements, to get towns, because that's the unit that we have to work with, to incorporate a forward-thinking vulnerability risk assessment, resilience planning in their planning. The state should provide funding for that, planning, technical assistance, tools, capacity, do that, and then provide funding to actually conduct those activities, make it possible to actually build things, to do community building, to do education that you need to do in your local towns.
And I think to unbundle the question on competitive bidding, I think the question was, did you find the competitive bidding process help or hinder municipal resilience efforts? If I could give the answer I think you would give, which is there's more to resilience than cost. There's more to moving forward than there are things we don't understand as costs. I think that's a cross-cutting piece of all. Well, excellent. And thank you all. I've enjoyed this conversation a ton. Jim, do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up? Are you muted out, Jim? Myself.
Thanks for organizing this, guys, and for such an elegant job of being the moderator, Joe. I'm glad I didn't try and do it. But my final point is, I'd like to stress is that this problem is going to be around for the next 20 to 50 years, right? And so we need to start taking a long view of this. And I think the step forward that happened this year in the state legislature with bills that will help towns raise money and support circuit to help towns plan projects. Those are positive things. And in a budget cycle, which is 2 years, that's about as best as you can do, right? So I think that the state is on a positive track, and we just need to stay focused on it for a persistent, long-term view of how to become more resilient everywhere.
Thank you. So thank you all. I'll just give one concluding thing, is that as the part of Circa, and the reason personally I like to engage with it and the work we do is our current project is to talk about finding gaps or confusion in policy areas. I know there's a lot of people on this webinar who are exactly the people we want to talk to. So if you have thoughts about resilience policy, things that need clarification, legal issues that appear vague or stumbling blocks to resiliency, I'd encourage you to please reach out to Circa. The message will get to us, or you can find Luann and I at our UConn addresses. So I'd really welcome the chance to hear from anyone in the audience, and thank you all. Yaprok, thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for all the panelists to join, and Joe, thank you so much for your moderating this. Just one final reminder to everybody, if you would like to see Ms. Cooley's presentation, we're going to post it, and you can reach it from our YouTube channel too. But in the meantime, you can check her fact sheet from here. And all of the webinars will be available as video and the presentations too, so you can come and check our website as well. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a nice weekend.
Bye.
Bye.